Hello learners. Welcome to the 34th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. I have been discussing the Anglo-Irish background for understanding the structures of feeling in the fiction of Elizabeth Bowen. I will continue that discussion and try to wrap up that discussion very quickly before moving on to the next writer in this series, whose name is Iris Murdoch. So I mentioned that the big house is an important category. And Elizabeth Bowen has her own idea of why these big houses are important. Elizabeth Bowen also has a very unique idea of exactly how and why the people in these big houses were deserving of sympathy. So, even though these people were very privileged, in a very obvious sense, they were quite privileged and they misbehaved. They indulged in irresponsible, sometimes very harmful behavior. These things were true, but still, Bowen finds some reasons to treat these people as tragic individuals. They are tragic in a philosophical sense of the word. The very basic philosophical definition of tragedy is the inability to choose between two equally good things, but the impossibility of choosing both. Individuals who are caught in these situations are usually treated as tragic protagonists. So, for Elizabeth Bowen, these privileged individuals could be treated as having a somewhat tragic life. But to understand that, we'll first read some quotes to understand what Bowen meant by the big house. In 1940, Elizabeth Bowen wrote an essay titled The Big House. And here's what Bowen writes: There was a true bigness, a sort of impersonality, in the manner in which the houses were conceived. After an era of greed, roughness, and panic, these new settlers who had been imposed on Ireland began to wish to add something to life. They began to feel and exert the European idea, to seek what was humanistic, classic, and disciplined. It is something to subscribe to an idea, even if one cannot live up to it. So, here, this is what the Anglo Irish landowners wanted in theory, or this is what their intention was. In reality, however, this intention was not realized, and here is how Bowen describes the reality. In Bowen's description, the idea of the big house got out of hand, and it ended up in a kind of struggle to keep up appearances. Here is how Bowen describes that struggle. Life in the big house, in its circle of trees, is saturated with character. This is, I suppose, the element of the spell, the indefinite ghosts of the past, of the dead who lived here and pursued the same routine of life in these walls, add something, a sort of order, a reason for living, to every minute and hour. This is the order, the form of life, the tradition to which big house people still sacrifice much. Now, in The Death of the Heart, we are not reading about an Irish household. We are, in fact, not reading about a house like Bowen's Court, a novel that reads like a fictional counterpart to Bowen's Court, the book, is The Dry September. But if one reads carefully, The Death of the Heart is a much more expanded and much more sharper emotional reimagining of what kind of structures of feeling would be created if one takes seriously the idea that the Anglo-Irish community was like lonely children being raised away from their families. And Portia Quain, the individual whose heart we are led to believe dies and comes alive and finds a way to exist at the end of the novel. Portia Quain is an orphan who is brought from Ireland, and her transition and her persistence, her survival, despite the death of her heart, can be read as a very powerful reimagination of what this emotional structures of the big houses would look and feel like if it were transported across the border and into England. I'll now read from a quote in which Bowen describes what happened and how they ended up in the middle of the 20th century. When I say how they ended up, I mean how and why the Anglo Irish community thought and felt the way they felt in 1939. Bowen gives a very powerful explanation of how the loss of privilege, how the experience of dispossession educates a whole community in a way of feeling, and how by writing and thinking about the history of these successive generations of her family, Elizabeth Bowen actually undertakes an education in style. So I'll explain more after I read the quote because it's a very powerful quote, and I think it really helps us understand how and why Elizabeth Bowen writes about the death of Portia's heart in The Death of the Heart. This is Bowen again. Education is not so important as people think. Nothing he learned, certainly, but at the same time, nothing he did not learn impaired Henry's flair for living, his innate stylishness, and his love of the grand. Henry, a preeminent social figure, lived in a Philistine, snobbish, limited, and on the whole pretty graceless society. But he got somewhere and lived to die in his drawing room, surrounded by hosts of children and the esteem of what looked like a lasting order. And to what did our fine feelings, our regard for the arts, our intimacies, our inspiring conversations, our wish to be clear of the bonds of sex and class and nationality, our wish to be fair to everyone bring us to 1939? So Henry here is a figure at the beginning of the Bowen family tree. This is a figure, probably Bowen's great grandfather, who inherited, who was gifted this house from the British monarch, a clear sign of the kind of power and the source of the power that the Bowens enjoyed. And here, Bowen is making a case through nostalgia for remembering the past, for not jumping to easy judgments about what education, privilege, and aligning with the right kind of politics does for individuals. The assumption would be that people like Henry were a debauched and decadent class, that they were privileged people who harmed others, and it's good that they died and made way for a more civilized, a more educated, a more equitable, a more democratic society. This is the traditional assumption. In this passage, however, Bowen questions that. Bowen says maybe what these crazy people, or what these people who, from our perspective, look like debauched, self destructive, decadent, privileged people, these people who simply did not know what to do with the money and the power that was gifted to them, and who went mad out of dispossession. Bowen is saying that these people might have made better decisions, and through their mistakes might have actually created for themselves a more peaceful life and death than we have. Because what have we have? And we in this sentence means people living in the middle of Second World War through the Blitz of London. Right? Second World War had broken out, and it seemed that democracy, civilization, all this was coming to an end, and it literally felt like the end of the world. Of course, the world here refers to the extremely privileged world. We can say that it was the end of the first world's world, not literally the world, because there were places in Asia and in South America and Africa where people had a very different experience of the Second World War. Destruction did not spare these places, but the experience of destruction and the sense of apocalypse was very different in these places. For a writer living in London, remembering her family's past in Ireland, the Blitz of London feels like the end of all education, privilege, feels like it proves the futility of all of the painful process of civilization through which the Anglo Irish community had to be dragged. And so the destruction that Bowen is witnessing around her as she writes these words seems to her to question what it was worth. What was the point of giving up the privilege of being part of the Union? What did Irish people gain from Home Rule? What did Irish people gain from being free of the hegemonic control of England? Now, those of you who've read the novel can tell that this is the perspective of the narrator who inhabits Portia Quain's perspective as a 16-year-old girl whose world seems to come crashing down multiple times. The first and most powerful instance is when she finds out that the family of rich people where she has been allowed to stay as a gift, where she's allowed to live at the sufferance of other privileged people, they have read her diary. And because in her diary she has written about the hypocrisies and the double standards of this society, they have been laughing at her. They have been laughing at her because they have found her to be too naive, too unaware of how things work in the world. It is violence. She suffers this violence. She has no other alternative but to tolerate this violence because she has no other way of surviving other than at the sufferance of these rich people in their big house in England. There are more such violences that Portia has to suffer, and at several times we can be under no doubt that for Portia Quain, the world is ending. Portia Quain feels, and as you will feel, and as I feel, as any reader will feel who reads the novel with sensitivity and care, what was the point of giving Portia Quain a place to live in this very privileged house if her privacy, if her innocence, if the solitude of her heart, if the observations and the perceptions that she had noted down with the innocence of a child, if those things were not allowed to exist, if they were to be ridiculed, what was the point of allowing her to live? So, in a way, this is a cynicism towards kindness. This is a sort of disconsolate sense of anger. And we can see how, for Elizabeth Bowen, this disconsolate anger comes from a deep perception of the past that her people have endured, and also the experience of observing London and Europe get absolutely obliterated during the Blitz in the early 1940s. I'll conclude this discussion of how Elizabeth Bowen thinks about childhood through her writing about the history of the Anglo-Irish community by reading from some more quotes from Bowen's book, actually. I'll recall briefly this thought that Bowen had when she learned that Bowen's court was demolished and was not allowed to exist. The sentence that she wrote was that Bowen's court did not live to become a ruin. The fact that Bowen's court exists only in her writing, and this existence as a memory, as something that Elizabeth Bowen describes and remembers, is actually more favorable to her than having a physical reminder of the site. This also connects to the idea that the dispossessed are actually very dangerous. So the fact that Bowen's court is demolished and there is no physical reminder means that Elizabeth Bowen, the novelist, has been afforded by the circumstances of her time a more sustainable, a more peaceful way of experiencing dispossession than her ancestors. So the fact that Bowen's court no longer exists means that Bowen is free to reconcile herself and live with dispossession as a novelist and not as someone who has lost power, is hungry for power, and whose hunger for power manifests itself in harm for others. Okay, I'll end this discussion of Elizabeth Bowen by reading from actually a short story titled The Parrot. I'm doing this because although this course is specifically titled Novels, I have recently found that Elizabeth Bowen's fame and appreciation and acclaim rests sometimes even more powerfully on the skill and the perfection that one finds in her short stories. In the year 2019, the Everyman Library edition published a collected stories and a complete stories edition of Elizabeth Bowen. And this collection has received a great deal of respect and appreciation. And so I just want to read from the opening of a short story titled The Parrot, which illustrates very powerfully the keen sense of observation, as well as a very keen sense of the experience of dispossession. Different people are dispossessed in different ways, and it takes a very keenly perceptive Anglo Irish dispossessed novelist like Elizabeth Bowen to be able to remain attuned to how other people are dispossessed. So, this is how the story The Parrot begins. When Mrs. Williston's parrot escaped, it rocketed in a pale green streak across the sky and settled in the chestnut tree at the foot of the garden, where it became invisible among the branches. Invisible, that is to say, to Maud Pemberty and Eleanor Fitch, who stood staring up under their hands into the glare of the morning, until Maud located his head, a vermilion blot borne up and down like a boy, slowly by the undulations of a lower layer of the foliage. The chestnut tree blazed all over in the sunshine with candles of wax blossom. The scent of the pollen gave Eleanor Fitch shivers. About the end of May, she would pass the tree on any pretext, sighing for something that she could not remember. Maud was in love, and chestnut flowers meant nothing to her. Besides, as parlour-maid, she had more to do in the house than Miss Fitch, who was only a companion. So, we see a very powerful synthesis of different kinds of descriptions and observations. The natural world is observed. Mrs. Williston's parrot escapes and it finds a place in the chestnut tree. The different people observing this tree occupy different positions within the household from which this tree is observed. Mrs. Williston is probably the landlord or the person who employs others. Maud Pemberley and Eleanor Fitch are women who work in there. Now, in order for this passage to achieve its full persuasive and powerful impact, it's important for readers to understand two things in a reciprocal way. The readers are taught to observe the natural world, which is the parrot leaving the house, escaping the window, settling somewhere in a tree, hiding among the branches moving with the wind, and through the movement of the foliage, the parrot being located, its vermilion blot being visible, all that. This observation is filtered through the perspectives of people who are in the house. Only then, and very naturally from there, we learn that this is not a uniform or a homogeneous observation, or the person observing or the source who's observing, or the gaze which is observing this natural world, is not a singular gaze, but is a composite gaze. It's made up of people who occupy different positions. They are all women, but they occupy different positions within the economic hierarchy of this household. This tells us a great deal about the kind of writer Elizabeth Bowen was, and short stories, more than novels, sometimes contain, in a very powerful manner, the strengths and accomplishments of this writer. With that, we reach the end of our discussion of Elizabeth Bowen and move to the next writer in the series of writers named Iris Murdoch. Now, in some ways, this is a very appropriate transition because Iris Murdoch also has a very strong connection to Ireland, just like Elizabeth Bowen, But unlike Bowen, Murdoch goes about dealing with that connection to Ireland in a very different way. So, who is Iris Murdoch? I'll read from Francis Wilson's biographical profile of Iris Murdoch, and this is how Francis Wilson writes about Murdoch. Murdoch's background, biography itself is quite intertwined with the kind of biographical writings that were produced about Murdoch. And these themselves were quite entangled with the kind of novels that Murdoch wrote and the kind of reception that Murdoch had. So I'll first provide some very, very basic facts about Iris Murdoch's life, then talk a little bit about the kind of fiction she wrote and the implications of that, and then describe how the fictions and its reception have complicated what is possible today to know about Murdoch's life. So, Iris Murdoch was a professor of philosophy at Oxford and was most well known both for her teaching and her public position as a professor of philosophy, as well as her very, very powerful reputation as a novelist. Iris Murdoch was a prolific novelist and averaged about a novel every 2 years. So, in total, Murdoch wrote about 26 novels and countless other prose. Writing novels was for Murdoch a way of practicing, implementing, going about the kind of philosophical ideals that she professed and taught in her job as a professor of philosophy. Now, it just so happens that a lot of Murdoch's novels take a very philosophical approach towards this institution of marriage itself. And quite a few of her novels involve open marriages and individuals not treating the conventional constraints or rules or expectations or the contractual obligations of marriage very seriously. It has later emerged that this freedom, this flexibility, this openness towards questioning the definition of marriage was something that Murdoch practiced in her own life as well, and it was not something that she only wrote about. And later on, this very flexible approach, this somewhat philosophical approach, led to complications in the way Murdoch's reputation was established and the way different writers, different biographers made different kinds of efforts to fix a kind of image or a kind of figure of the writer who Iris Murdoch was. The first shot in this game may be said to have been fired by the novelist and critic John Bailey, who was Iris Murdoch's husband for most of her life. John Bailey published a trilogy of best selling memoirs, starting with Iris and Elegy for Iris Murdoch, followed by Iris and the Friends, and concluding with Widower's House. Now, the first of this trilogy, Elegy for Iris, began as a memoir of John Bailey's meeting, courtship, life, living with Iris, and tried to make sense of Iris Murdoch's experience with Alzheimer's and her descent into a sort of dependent body from being an extremely powerful, intellectually very sharp philosopher and novelist. Elegy for Iris is an extremely moving document in which John Bailey describes how he and Iris Murdoch met and the kind of life they led at Oxford, the different intellectual and creative pursuits they both led, how intellectually they fed off each other, how they shaped each other, and ultimately how, towards the end of her life, Iris Murdoch was reduced to a dependent body, and how, through caring for her while she descended into Alzheimer's, John Bailey understood a great deal about himself, about Iris, and ultimately about life itself. So it began with this, and then he wrote two more books in a similar vein. Later on, other contemporaries, other novelists, painters, and writers also wrote successive memoirs about Iris Murdoch, and in these different accounts, very different sorts of reputations were created. Peter Conradi was one of them, and Ian Wilson was another. I'll quote from some of these briefly in the next lecture, but for now, I want to flag something which is the treatment of conjugal relations, but also the treatment of relations between men and women in a philosophical vein, and particularly in a feminist vein, by novelists like Iris Murdoch, but other novelists as well. This was a time when a lot of writers were experimenting with descriptions of marriages and experimentations with marriages in their novels. And one very, very notorious and well known example of a novelist who did that was D.H. Lawrence. And I'll read from a quote by Virginia Woolf, in which Woolf writes about a novel by D.H. Lawrence, tries to explain the kind of scandal that was created, and describes the intellectual and literary historical value of such scandalous writing. This is what Virginia Woolf writes in 1920, reviewing D.H. Lawrence's book, The Lost Girl. It was plain that sex had, for Lawrence, a meaning which it was disquieting to think that we too might have to explore. I'll explore this idea in greater detail, but for now, I want to end with this idea that for Murdoch, a philosopher who wrote novels, it was very clear that D.H. Lawrence had stumbled on something very reflective of their age, which is that sex and sexuality are matters of great human concern. Even though readers may be scandalized, it is in the kinds of scandal that society goes through that writers with an intellectual and sensitive bent of mind realize that there is something required, there is something complicit, there is something very fundamental in the nature of that scandal. How societies are scandalized by descriptions of marriages and relations between men and women says something about society, and it is a duty of novelists to remain committed to writing in this manner, and it is a duty of scholars to pay attention to the kind of problems that such readings produce. I'll discuss Iris Murdoch's work, A Severed Head, and explain more about this philosophical background in the next lecture. Thank you.